I would also like to virtually introduce Ellen Helgeson, recreation therapist with Alberta Health Services, who will be joining us virtually and moderating the online audience today. I am part of the Community Partners in Action Group, and behalf of the Community Partners in Action Group, we promise and are excited for a wonderful afternoon of learning. And we ask that you be patient as we try to navigate these new sense of normal of delivering education online and in person as well. We have just completed our in-person orientation for our audience here today when you screened at the front door. And a reminder for everybody viewing at home to please have your audio on mute. And any questions that you have will be answered at the end in our question and answer period. The way people experience dementia really depends on many factors, and these include their physical makeup, their emotional resilience, and the supports that are available to people in a community. And all types of dementia are progressive, and this means that the structure of the brain and the chemistry in the brain changes over time. And how quickly dementia progresses will be dependent on the individual, and each person is unique and experiences dementia in their own unique way. I would like everyone to join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Chan, who has come from Edmonton today to join us. And she is one of Alberta's top care of the elderly physicians. And we're very excited for her to share her knowledge with us about how our brain ages and changes and how she approaches a diagnosis of dementia. Dr. Chan is an academic professor with the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta, a care of the elderly physician with the home living geriatric consult team in Edmonton, and the AHS medical staff in family medicine in the Edmonton zone. As mentioned, there will be a question and answer period at the end of her presentation today. I will be happy to help anybody in person, and Ellen will be moderating online. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chan to our community.
Yeah, because I just find it's hard to hold on to. It's really hard to hold on to questions for like a long period of time. At least for me, I have to write it down or else I forget. So I like to, when we switch topics, maybe we'll just take a break and do questions at that time, because usually there's actually a lot of questions about the aging brain. And then the next topic in terms of dementia, I'm sure there's going to be lots too. Okay, I think I probably have to sit down because I have to manage this, and maybe it might be easier to put on the at work, I think. Perfect. I see some nodding heads online, so that is perfect. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about, I am trying to modulate my voice because I don't want to be too loud on the online session, but also so that you guys can hear me. But please just wave your hand if you can't hear me, if I've decided to, talk really not loud enough. So the first thing I want to talk about is the aging brain, and I'm so happy to see the people in person have the PowerPoint, and it's like beautiful color printouts. It's amazing. I love it. I'm glad I put lots of colorful pictures because that's how I like to entertain myself. So let's see. Okay, let's see how I'm going to forward this. Oh, there we go. Okay, so these are the things that I hope to tell you a little bit about today. I have I think about an hour for each topic, but maybe a little bit less. I tried to keep it so it's a little bit shorter. So hopefully I run on time today. But hopefully what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today is what's normal in terms of changes, because the truth is, as we age, all of us change. And there are some things that are expected to be very normal in terms of how our brain changes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and to, how to hopefully recognize when something is not maybe related just to aging, that maybe there's something else that's going on that needs to be looked after. And also, I love the last thing I'm going to tell you about is lots of people want to know, particularly my patients, my family members, my friends, they want to know, how do you protect your brain? How do you, age well over time? And how do you, do the best you can to keep your health as good as possible? And I'm going to talk about that and hopefully spend the most time on that piece. Okay, so normal changes of the brain. You might already know this. I noticed that there's a lot more media about this now, but as we get older, our brain actually physically shrinks in size. Every decade, about 5% smaller. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But it's give or take. It's of course not completely 5% all the time, and not everyone is the same. But in general, most people, you'll see that shrinkage. And people think about, okay, well, is it really brain cells dying or what's going on? But what we know is that it's not just, brain cells that are dying, but it's also the cushion, the sheath, myelin, that is around all of our nerve cells and brain cells. That shrinks a little bit, and that accounts for a lot of that shrinkage as well. So you're not really necessarily losing those wonderful brain cells that help you do things. You're losing that cushion around them, and sometimes that also makes it so that they fire not as quickly anymore. So when you look at in MRIs, when functional MRI is just this, you go in a scanner, you lie there, and it scans your brain for function, like how much sugar is it using, what's going on. Is that we find that in people who are younger, they tend to use one side of the brain more than the other, but as we get older, we actually end up using both sides of the brain. Oh, sorry. That's the second one. But this is the right slide, I think. We tend to use both sides of the brain, and we don't actually know why that is. Is it that we end up having to recruit the other side to compensate, to do the same functions, or are we actually getting more function out of our brain? It's hard to say, but that's kind of one of the things that we do, is we use both sides. And in general, as we get older, what we notice is those neurotransmitters, those chemicals in our brains that actually carry the messages between cells, we actually have generally a little bit less as we get older. And they think that that may be why, signals kind of travel a little bit slower. It might take us a little bit longer to process things, because just simply like the chemistry of our body is taking a little bit longer to make that happen. So those are kind of different changes that are normal. What we'll see kind of in terms of day to day when we're talking with people who are a little bit, as we get older, is that you'll see slower reaction times. So it might take longer to kind of take things in and then respond, and that's completely normal. One of the things we also notice is that our attention level gets a little bit low. It's harder to pay attention for really long times. I had, recently a patient, and he was a very.
Station, please. Sound to the nursing station, please.
Oh, sorry. There's somebody. There's an announcement overhead at somebody's place. But what we noticed is that our attention gets lower. And then I had a patient recently. He's a very smart university professor, and he told me he's really noticed his attention is gotten like not as good. He's very worried. He's getting dementia. And so I told him, tell me a little bit more. Like, so what do you notice? And he tells me, he's like, well, I used to read 55 scientific papers a day and absorb every single thing from them. And he's like, I feel like I just can't get through them anymore. I'm only reading 45. And I told him, well, I would say that this is probably a normal change of aging, and it's that you can't keep your attention as long. You just need more breaks, and that's okay. It's not a sign that anything abnormal is going on. So, it's about expectation too, right? But I think you can't expect to do exactly the same things that you did 10 years ago. We always know this, as well as time goes on, is people have a little bit of a slower processing speed. We think about things, and it's not that we didn't get the message. It's just a bit slower to respond and kind of get the full message. And sometimes I think that we all experience this, is where we're like, can you just say that again? Because I'm not sure that I got kind of everything, especially if somebody's speaking very quickly, or there's just too much information coming at you. It takes longer for your brain to process. One of the things that we also noticed is a change is that episodic memory changes a little bit over time. So after our middle ages, in 40s, 50s, we tend to actually have a little bit harder time remembering kind of small, like short memories or things that were not particularly important. You don't need to, but we just don't remember it as clearly. It's like, oh, you remember that day, or one of the common things that I always give people an example is that I used to work as a waitress throughout my teenage years and in university as well, is that there were certain customers, they walked in the door and I knew their order right away. That's kind of an episodic memory thing, but it has no real relevance to me now. But there are some people I still remember, and I must say over time, I don't remember their orders anymore. And sometimes I still ran into them, and then like it just cues me in the moment. But that's not important, right? Sometimes it's okay you don't remember some of those things, and your episodic memory about specific instances goes down over time, and that's normal. So I wanted to take a little survey here, and people can participate in person and also online as well. Is that, can I ask people maybe in the room to raise their hand? How many of you have misplaced your car or forgot where you parked it in the past month or so? Me, definitely me. Has anybody, misplaced their purse? I actually stopped carrying a purse because I tend to forget it places. So I just make sure I have pockets on me. I had to stop doing that. And this is another question, is that has anybody kind of gone to introduce somebody you run into and you're saying, oh, please introduce yourself. Yeah, that's me too. I actually, in fact, did it with my very best friend in the entire world, and I just like ran into somebody we knew, and I said, "Hey, this is right, introduce yourself," and she just died laughing the whole time. And I'm like, "Yes, I know your name is Chantel," and I just forgot for the moment. That's all those kinds of things are quite normal. Particularly because of the different kinds of brain. Like the parking thing is that we tend to go to the same places over and over, but we don't park in the exact same spot every time. And that makes it even more difficult because our brain is like, this is very similar. It's hard to figure out where it was. So those are just kind of some examples of things where you might say in the moment, haha, I'm losing it, but it's absolutely normal at any age to have those lapses. So, in general with normal aging, things that you might notice is that you're going to forget a conversation from a year ago. You might even forget a conversation from a month ago or a week ago because maybe it didn't have that much relevance to you. And yes, we forget things, like we do. It's normal. And the more distracted we are or the more stressed out that we are, the more that we'll see that happen. So sometimes that oftentimes is more the case. You might have trouble finding words. I have that as well. I'm trying to describe it, and then I end up just describing it. And they're like, oh, you're talking about a strainer. Yes, the strainer. And mentioned it. You might not remember your acquaintance's name or your best friend's name. That just is how it happens, and it's okay. It's normal. So now I'm going to switch over and I'm going to talk like the second half this afternoon a lot more about dementia. But just in general, I wanted to kind of have a quick peek in there. And I don't expect you to look at all the numbers in this chart, but what I want to highlight is, it's generally a small percentage of people who develop dementia over time. There's kind of this myth, and I feel like especially in healthcare, we see everybody who has illness. We see people who are not well, and maybe we don't see enough people who are well. And I swear to you, like most of medical students or residents, they think everybody has dementia. And I have to tell them and remind them that that's not true. The majority of people don't have dementia. It does get to be a higher percentage as we get older. So, over the age of 85, it's about 25%, but that's still 75% of people who don't have dementia, and the grand majority will never get it, and they won't have that sort of trouble. So I think that's really important to highlight that some people have it, but the majority will not. This is a picture of my grandmother and my little nephew together. And I think that I really kind of put this in here to remind myself too, because my grandmother, even though she's 95 this year, she doesn't have dementia, but she is elderly, she's frail, she has a lot of medical conditions. And she ended up having a fall a couple years ago, and she hit her head and she got a concussion. And as a result of that, they decided she can't go home anymore. And she ended up going to a nursing home because of her health care issues. And one of the things that was really, really upsetting to me is that everybody at the nursing home treated her like she had dementia. And they were extremely ageist about this, and and they wouldn't listen to her, and they insisted on actually locking her in bed, like putting up all the bed rails all around her bed, and told her, you can't get out, you have to call for a nurse. And of course, my grandmother, being the very stubborn lady that she is, insisted on climbing over the rails every single night. But until it was really brought forward, and we had to advocate, all the way up the chain to say, like, this lady does not have dementia. You need to listen to what she says because she's her own decision maker. It was pretty bad. So I think that it's always a reminder that we need to actually look at the person always and not just assume. Unfortunately, it happens a lot. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the changes that we might notice over time that are not completely normal. We say that when somebody is always forgetful, like my mother, I'll give her an example. She's always been forgetful. Always she's misplacing things, and she forgets things, like she puts things in the laundry and then 2 days later she forgets that the laundry was in there. And that's no change. But some people that we know are very sharp, and everybody's sharp about something. But over time, when you notice a change from the baseline, that might be a change that things are not normal. It's not those kind of small things, but it's kind of big things and it keeps happening over time. One of the other big signs that we see is other people are noticing that maybe things are not completely, right, and they're mentioning, yeah, I've kind of noticed there's something going on. That I usually pay attention to, because people who know you know when there's been a change usually and things are not quite right. So I put this little sign in here. I love this. This is out from the Alzheimer's Society. It's the 10 warning signs of Alzheimer's disease. And it's got a bunch of squares, and I blew up the squares too, so it's easier to read because they're so very tiny. And these are the things that, I think are very telling sometimes when there's something going on, especially when you have more than one of these boxes happening. So I'm going to go through this a little bit more, just in more detail. And so the box number 1 is about memory loss. And I mentioned to you, there's lots of little memory problems and tricks that our brain plays on us, and those are completely normal. But it's a problem, it becomes a problem or not normal when it affects your day-to-day living. Like you're really forgetting to do things that are quite important, like going for a doctor's appointment, or forgetting to get your refills even after you've actually forgotten, after you've actually even run out. That's one of the big diagnostic criteria, or the ways that I know that somebody actually has something abnormal going on, is when the memory problem causes them to not be able to do the things that they should be doing to make their day-to-day life work. And for some people, it's quite severe. Other people, it's kind of minor, but that's always the thing you notice. It's memory loss affecting that. The second item there, where a second box there that says difficulty performing familiar tasks. This is something that we might be able to do like without thinking, but then all of a sudden we need to think about it really hard. I had, when I was still training my preceptor, he had this one patient, and she always would bring us banana bread every time she came into the office, for her regular checkups, when she had any problem. And then he learned that actually, that before she would leave for the appointment, he would always taste the banana bread, because then he would know whether or not something was going on with her. If the banana bread tasted good, she was all good. If the banana bread tasted off, then without fail, it meant that she had she was sick, or she was getting sick, something was happening. And that's kind of one of those things, is that she could bake banana bread in her sleep, but something was kind of putting her off on those days. And then that became one of our tests, one of our physical exams. But that's one of the signs when something's not quite going well in the brain. And it's not always just dementia, right? It could just be illness, something's happening, but it's one of those warning signs. So box number 3, talking about, is problems with language. So I mentioned about it's okay to, you know, forget people's names and have trouble maybe thinking of a specific name for something. It happens all the time. But it's when it's more familiar things and it starts happening all the time. And you begin to be searching for your words like and not be able to find them, and it becomes very frustrating, usually for the person, more for the person who's actually trying to communicate than the people who are communicating with them, because we tend to learn how to mind read a little bit. But that's one of the things is when that starts and it keeps going, you notice more and more. So box number 4 is something that usually only happens later, when you have when you have a problem with your brain or you're developing dementia. It's usually later in the time frame that you start having disorientation, like you're not sure if it's night or day. You're not quite sure what month it is or what season it is. Those are kind of one of the signs that something's not working well with your brain. And you know, it may be normal, like this morning or this afternoon with Jennifer greeting everybody with good morning. Hey, that happens. But she almost immediately was like, wait a second, it's the afternoon. And that happens. But when it kind of happens more consistently, it's worrisome. Box number 5 is about impaired judgment. And that illustration is about, you know, going out in the snow and the cold, and she's not even wearing a jacket. She's wearing kind of summery shoes, making, when the judgment starts, start making decisions that make people question if you're really safe or are you actually doing the best. There are some people, like I honestly have a really good friend in snowy weather like that. She's wearing a t-shirt and sandals, but that's always the way she's been even as a teenager. So that's no change. Although, unfortunately, because of ageism, as she gets older, people might start questioning whether or not she's making good judgments. And so that's where history comes into play as well. So number 6 is about problems with abstract thinking. It's more about difficult tasks, things that, you know, you have to really stop and think about. I don't do my taxes anymore, but when I did, it took me hours and hours to try to wrestle with it. I could do it, but it was really a big effort. And it's noticing when, you know, difficult tasks like that, it takes you longer and longer, or you just really can't do it. That's one of the signs that something's not working well. So number 7, misplacing things. We talked about this, but it's really it's not just as simple as kind of forgetting where you put your purse in the house, but it's like, oh, my glasses are in the freezer. Oh, my shoes are, you know, in a very odd place. It's kind of like where things don't necessarily make so much sense and you're losing them all the time. And one of the common things I see is people misplacing their bank card, and they have to get like 10 different bank cards in the course of a short period of time. So you'll see that. Number 8 is one that is usually the most disturbing to people and your loved ones, is that there's changes maybe in your personality and your mood. Sometimes people get angry or they're more irritable, and they're really just not themselves. And it's not just memory problems or dementia that causes that. There can be many medical issues as well, but this is also one of the signs, you know, maybe something's not right. Something needs to get checked out. And that's 8 and 9 together, really, in terms of the personality and mood changes. And number 10 is one that not everybody gets, but a very large majority, is that people lose their get up and go. You know, they just really need a lot of guidance to keep going, or they just have lost all interest in their hobbies, and they're not sad about it. They're not bored. They're just, you know, sitting watching the news channel or weather channel, or sometimes just snow on the TV, and they're like, oh, I'm fine. And it comes on slowly, and it's one of those things where I find people oftentimes say, I think that they're depressed. And then you have to ask a lot more questions around, well, what do you mean by that? Well, they just sit there all day long and they don't do anything. And that's kind of the 10th sign, all of this. And as I mentioned, any one of these, it doesn't really mean that you have dementia. It's just when these are the signs when they're together. You start wondering, oh, okay, maybe something's not working quite as well as it should be. So, okay, what do you do if you notice these abnormal changes? And again, I don't want you to say, like, I don't want to say it means you have dementia or you have a problem, but what it does mean is that I think there's something that was worthwhile looking into. And I would encourage, if you notice abnormal changes in yourself or if other people notice, is to encourage people to actually get a checkup. go to your doctor, get it checked out, and you might get completely reassured that, oh, it's just because, you're stressed out. Maybe this is the thing you can do. Or, oh my gosh, you actually have this medical problem going on and we can fix this. Because the worst thing is to kind of ignore it and then not fix the problem and kind of make it get worse when maybe if you caught it earlier, it could have been better. So that's one of the big things. And I'll talk a little bit more about what happens kind of when you go to the doctor's office and what the doctor might look at if they suspect you're having some memory troubles or you're having brain problems. Okay, so this is my favorite part of it, is about how to keep your brain healthy. This is what people want to know. So I put in a few categories here that I'm going to talk about: diet, I'm going to talk about physical activity, about sleep, managing your health, and making sure that your medications are looked at. And sometimes it's like that. You have lots of medications and maybe we need to cut some down and change them, or it might be that you're actually missing some things that you really need and that you didn't know were missing. So this is a point that I really, really wanted to make, is ageism could kill you. Did you know that? Yeah, your mindset about aging and your thoughts about, getting old actually make a big difference. So Dr. Becca Levi, which is, she's at Yale, big university. She's spent her whole academic career studying this, and she's come up with some really interesting work that have showed that people. So in 2002 she interviewed an entire town of people in the USA, and asked them about their views on aging, and she followed them up like 23 years later. To look at, what happened to all these people based on what their views were. They were kind of younger people, they were older people. And what she found is actually people who actually express negative views on aging, they, associated like aging with being disabled or problems like that. She found that they died 7.6 years younger than people who had positive views. So, this is huge because your brain actually causes, your brain has a big effect on how your body is doing. And, nobody really 100% knows why this is, but there has been other research shown that when you ever have a negative view on aging, and you're associating it with bad things, it actually raises your heart rate and increases the stress hormones in your body. So those negative thoughts are directly perhaps driving your body to age or have more adverse health outcomes. So it's just something to think about, is that, honestly, is aging really that bad? And is it worth you driving your body towards that end, which is kind of what this research is showing. And interestingly, the opposite. So they were looking at, Dr. Levi as well, we're looking at, can you protect people when they have positive views on aging? And they actually studied people with an ApoE gene. So this is the gene that's known to increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. It makes it twice as likely for you to develop Alzheimer's, but it's not 100%. So she grabbed a whole bunch of people who tested positive for this gene in the States. And she looked at their positive, whether they had positive or negative beliefs about aging. And those people with the positive beliefs about aging, they actually were 50% less likely to actually develop Alzheimer's. So, you don't know the mechanism, but it's all like the power of your brain and your thought is really huge. And I wanted to put that out there because there really is, and I see this almost more and more, that people are very dismissive of people who are older. I think that, and they just don't have the same like values about it, and they don't value people who are older. But I think like this is one of the most wonderful things. This is why I love what I do, because I get to interact with older people all the time, and they have so much to teach me. And it's fantastic. And I think that if somehow we could just change the culture and change our own thinking, even if we can't change the broad, that will make everybody healthier at the end of the day. So I wanted to emphasize that piece. So I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about exercising. And I put in there and I ask, can I exercise my problems away? Can I make this all go away with exercise? And the answer is kind of yes, actually. It's very interesting that, we know that people who are not active, they actually at a higher risk for developing dementia if you're very inactive. And just exercising alone actually improves people's brain functioning. When you're doing testing and you're kind of getting them onto a program and testing them before and after, they actually have better results or outcomes. And one of the things that people always ask me is like, well, how much exercise is good enough for exercise? And the studies actually do tell you it's about 30 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week, and it's moderate intensity. People want to know what moderate intensity? It means you're a little bit winded. It doesn't mean you're like, oh, sweating and you feel like your heart's gonna rip out of your chest, because it's really just, walking at a pace or doing some sort of activity where you're kind of a little bit short of breath and you kind of need to huff a little bit. That's all. 30 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. And in those people where they did kind of that, they actually have in people who have already been diagnosed with dementia or they have memory problems, they actually noticed that the ones who exercised on a regular basis, they had a slower decline. It took them longer to kind of worsen over time. So it's never too late to, get the body going. So the next page is, can I eat my memory problems away? Can I eat the problems away? And the answer is kind of yes, actually. There is a lot of research on this. Food science is a real kind of big thing. And it's really kind of something to think about. It's actually super complex. In medical school, I have to honestly tell you, we didn't really learn about nutrition. We didn't learn a whole lot about how to counsel people on nutrition. And up until recently, we were just giving people the Canada Food Guide, the old Canada Food Guide, which actually really wasn't the healthiest of diets. And it was actually heavily influenced by industry, people who said, oh, the grain farmers wanted to put more grain in the Canada Food Guide, and they sponsored it, and then they got more grain in the food guide. So the newer Canada Food Guide is better, and it doesn't really have that same bias in it. It still maybe has a little bit, to be honest with you, but it's very important. There has been research that shows that the Mediterranean diet, as well as the DASH diet, don't ask me about the nitty gritty details of it, but it's really in general, lots of fruits and vegetables and whole foods. Like the less processed the food is, the better. And one that I see included in your package is actually the Brain Health Food Guide. This is a guide that was made based on evidence. It's a Canadian thing, which actually I think I like it better because it gives you more specific things to avoid or more specific things to try that can improve your diet overall. And I know, it's very difficult to actually change your diet. And I'll be honest, like after the Brain Health Food Guide came out, I've been trying to do more of that. I've been throwing lentils and things and putting like a handful of like green peas, frozen peas and things just to make sure I get some more of the good things that they're talking about. So I'm not asking people, I never do, to say completely change your diet, but maybe adding a little bit of the good things, cutting out some of the bad things. You'll notice on the bad things list, it has like cookies and pictures of all the good things that I really, really like. But it's in moderation. It's not that you can't have any, it's that maybe have a little bit less. But it's all a balance, I think, in terms of what works for you. But I put in the Brain Health Food Guide just because I think it's easier to follow than a lot of the other guides, for me anyway. I like instructions. So that's good. Oh, I put that in there. Okay, so in order to, keep yourself healthy, can you keep the doctor away? That's the next question. And the answer is no. This is one of the things that unfortunately, we try to avoid going to see the doctor, not as badly as we avoid seeing the dentist, but this is really important because many of the things that affect our health and especially affect our brain health as we get older, they start causing you problems in your middle ages. And if you never take care of it, it ends up damaging your organs, like including your brain. So some of these that are really kind of insidious, they sneak underneath and you don't know it, is like high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol. Those kinds of things are not things that cause you pain. you don't notice it. And that's why it's important to kind of get checked up so that you catch it before it starts damaging all your organs at the end of the day. I heard a really sad story just last month about, somebody who's very young, actually in their 50s, who had most likely high blood pressure for many, many years, but she didn't know until her kidneys gave out. And all of a sudden she has no functioning kidneys, and it's all because of blood pressure that was never treated. And it's really, really a sad story. And we try to avoid the doctor, but please, this is one of the things, is that you should get checked out every once in a while. At least every year or two. It's okay. It's good, even if you think you have no problems. So one of the things as well, that is a really big masquerader for memory problems is depression and anxiety. Many people go untreated with these illnesses because, there's maybe some shame or some stigma related to it. But actually being treated for those things and controlling your depression and anxiety makes it less likely for you to actually have brain trouble later in your days. It is a risk factor, particularly untreated illness as time goes on. So one of the things that also your doctor can do, or I actually think the pharmacist is really great at this, is looking over your medications. Because as we change over time, it's not going to be like you start this pill. I kind of hate this when people say you're going to take this pill for the rest of your life. I don't actually believe that. There are definitely, some medications, most likely you'll have to take it for the long term, but maybe you may not need it at the end of life, or you might not have benefit anymore. So it's really important to kind of take a look at those medications to see if they're still the right thing. And one of the things that I see that tends to sneak a lot into is a lot of supplements and over-the-counter medications. And it's important to look at those too, because I have unfortunately seen some people who have, started having memory troubles, and they're like, oh, they're really just not doing well. And then when I actually get all their medications, they're like, oh yes, and we're taking this supplement, and they hand me the bottle, and I look at it, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is actually a neurotoxin. It's actually been proven to kill your brain cells. And you're taking this how often? And they're like, twice a day, because it says it's for brain health. I'm like, it definitely is not for brain health. And so it's really important, because you think that a lot of these medications, they're selling it for, good brain health or keeping your memory alive. They are actually not good things in them. And it is important to have that checked out and make sure that it's not, just don't buy anything that says it's good for your brain, because unfortunately I've had the experience where it's really not good for your brain. And that person that had those, she got a lot better after we stopped taking that supplement that was good for her brain. So it's important to look at that. So smoking, that's one of the big risk factor for a lot of things, for cancer, but also for dementia. So keeping your brain happy, if you can even cut down, I tell people, if you can cut down even a little bit, that would be helpful. Even if you can't quit. Alcohol in moderation. This is kind of one of those popular topics. Like they'll always report it in the news when there's a study that says, oh, if you drink a glass of wine every day, you're gonna live a long time. People are really excited about that. And honestly, it kind of comes and goes. It's really, the evidence is not super clear. The only thing that's clear is that for alcohol, you don't want to drink too much. So for women, Canada's official guideline is 10 or less drinks per week. When I'm talking to my patients and I say, people who are older, you should not have more than 1 drink a day. And that would be the ideal, and not, don't drink all those drinks. Like if I say it's, they're like, okay, so that's 7 drinks. I'm like, yeah, but don't drink them all in one setting. Drink it over the time period, and that's okay. So, some in moderation. Nothing is completely off the books. Like I said about the cookies and the cakes and everything, nothing's completely off the books. I find that if you forbid something from me, I really want it. So you gotta keep it in check. Okay, so the next question is, can I take a pill for that? This is my parents' friends, they constantly ask me this. They're like, is there something I can take that will make sure I don't get dementia, right? And the answer is no. I'm really sad to say, I wish I could tell you that we have something that you could take. that will guarantee or, you know, even cut down the risk of you having dementia. But it's not true. We just don't have those kinds of medications. And there is a lot of popularity, particularly with supplements, about saying, oh, it's going to, you know, prevent Alzheimer's. It's going to be, and some of the ones I've listed there, like that are very, that have come through the years, come and gone, vitamin E, omega-3s, you know, B complex vitamins, ginkgo biloba, all those things about, you know, oh, they're going to make you so much better and you're going to ward off dementia. None of them have shown benefit when you really put them to the test, unfortunately. But if you like to take them, sure, and they're not going to interact with other problems, that's okay. But some of them have also shown a little bit of harm over time for some of these things too. So I'm not keen on taking medication. So I try to, you know, talk reasonably about it. If you want to take it, it's fine. But if you don't, then don't take it. Don't feel like you have to. One of the things they put at the bottom there is that if you're going to buy a natural supplement, make sure that it actually has an NPN, a natural product number, because that means at least there's some oversight from the government. They had to get some sort of approval and some sort of testing at some point. It's still no real guarantee, but at least it has something to look, it's something, somebody looked at it, you know, that has no stake in the company. Or the homeopathic medicine numbers as well. So, you know, a lot of people are ordering stuff online, particularly now because of the pandemic, is that if it doesn't have an NPN number, I become really, really suspicious because it means there's actually no oversight about what goes into that pill. So I get concerned about that. Okay, so the next question is, can I sleep my problems away? And the answer is, it's not quite clear. It's not exactly, you can, you know, if you sleep 12 hours a day, you're going to be great. Or if you know, sleep 6 hours a day, you're going to be great. Some studies have shown that people who sleep a lot, like more than 9 hours, they have an increased risk of dementia. The theory behind it is sometimes these people who sleep a lot, they actually have some sort of underlying problem like sleep apnea. And so the quality of sleep they're getting is very poor. So they're still very tired. So they end up sleeping a lot more. And that's why maybe they're sleeping too much. Or for some of these studies, they found that maybe they actually have depression underlying. And the reason why they don't have energy, they want to sleep all the time is because their mood is not good. And there are, you know, there is evidence that unfortunately people who have sleep apnea or people who have insomnia have a higher risk of having dementia. If you think about it this way, is that sleep is when your brain rests, and that's when your body takes the time to clean out all the junk in your brain and get rid of it in your body. So if you don't sleep, then you're not getting rid of all the mental garbage, I say, out of your brain. And we know, honestly, that if people don't sleep for 3 days, they literally get delirious. They literally go crazy if you haven't slept for 3 days. So you think about their cumulative over time, if you don't sleep well, then that might have some effect. But one of the things that I find people are really obsessed with, that everybody is different. Not everybody needs to sleep, you know, 6 hours or even 8 hours a night. And this prescribing, and you'll see the recommended is, you know, 7 to 9 hours for adults between 26 and 64. It's 7 to 8 hours for people to 65 or older, because physiologically, we need less sleep as we get older, but people obsess over these numbers. And I find that obsession actually drives them to sleep less. And it causes anxiety. And I say, you know, it doesn't matter how long you sleep, as long as you feel rested at the end of the night, or at the end of the morning. You wake up and you're like, yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm all right. And for some people, it's like, you know, they sleep 3 or 4 hours and they're like, I'm good to go. Let's go. I'm not one of those people. Not many people are. And I know other people who are like, if I get 10 solid hours, I'm good to go. So, you know, that is a big hot topic. And I find there's a lot of recommendations like, if you're not sleeping this long, you should get drugs to put you out for that long. And unfortunately, the medications that put people to sleep actually tend to increase your risk of getting dementia at the end of the day. They're not entirely sure why, but you know, many of the over-the-counter sleep medications that I look out for, what's in them is Gravol, It's Benadryl in them. And all of those medications actually have an anticholinergic effect. So they actually block the neurotransmitters in your brain. And sometimes if you take it for long enough, you get pretty confused taking those over-the-counter medications. Or if you're just taking, some people actually do, they're like, Gravol puts me to sleep, so I take Gravol every night. And over time, that does affect your brain quite a bit. So sleep, try not to obsess over it, sleep when you can, and at most, if you're having trouble with sleep or you're not feeling rested, it's worthwhile checking into it, because many people I find now are being diagnosed with sleep apnea later in life, because they've had it their whole life. They were snoring, but it was never a thing before. We didn't know it was a problem. We just thought snoring was normal. Okay, so the next one is, can I meditate my problems away? So yeah, you actually can. Maybe. Regular meditation actually has been shown to improve people's brain functioning over time. And the longer you do it, the better. And it actually has also people who tend to do this meditation long term. They've shown that they actually are less likely to decline over time. They lose less function. One of the kind of more popular things right now is something called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's actually like a specific program of meditation. And it actually shows improvement in people who already have had abnormal brain changes. So they've kind of gotten back, some have gotten back a little bit more normal, or some have just improved. I had the pleasure of actually doing a mindfulness-based stress reduction workshop. It was like an 8-week thing that I did, and it was very interesting actually. And I must say, I have to think that this is personal bias. I'm not selling anything, but I feel like I feel better and I understand myself better. And I know, and one of the things I think that might be helping people is that it teaches you how to recognize when something's wrong with you, you're not well, or you feel the stress in your body and you're just like, whoa, stop a second. Why do I feel like this? And then you start working towards solving those problems. And I think maybe that might be why this mindfulness-based stress reduction actually works, because it makes you more aware of when something's not right and doing something about it. So this was something that was very popular a little while ago, about brain games, like computer games, there was Luminosity, all these things, to try to get people just playing these games, because this is going to save you. You're not going to get dementia if you keep playing these games. And unfortunately, they did tons of studies on this. What the studies show is that if you play these games, you get better at the games, but you actually don't get better in terms of your actual brain functioning. And especially because some of them are very repetitive. What I do want to say about this piece is that that even though the games don't work, what really does actually tend to help is when people try different things. They challenge themselves and they make new pathways in their brains. That's what helps. The experiences and doing something different actually builds your brain and builds things, but not necessarily just playing these games. I'm sure there's some Sudoku fans in here, but please do continue your Sudoku because it's for enjoyment. So in summary, this is my last slide about is that our brains are going to change. Most of us are not going to get dementia. And if you take your health seriously and make sure that you take care of yourself, you're going to have a better chance of actually leading a healthy life as an older adult and be healthier in general. Definitely consider adopting a positive aging attitude. There was actually one study about people, they got them to even write down, think of positive things about aging, things that you want to write to yourself in 10 years from now. And that study, they didn't follow them up long enough to see if they did better. But what they saw was in the short term, people started to taking care of themselves more actually when they were thinking about the future, and it actually improved their health in the moment, which is important. So exercise regularly if you can, whatever you can manage, and eat a healthy, balanced diet, whatever that means, because there's a lot of kind of conflicting information on that. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions if anybody has any, and open it up. Oh, is there a, let me see. I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. There's a chat, and then did you globally muted everybody? Is that what you're saying? Oh, okay, perfect. Wonderful. Yeah, any questions online? People can tap it in or in person. I'll repeat the question. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, perfect. So I'm just going to repeat the question for the people online is that somebody here is asking, they do a lot of smoothies, green smoothies, putting a lot of vegetables and they, make a smoothie out of it. And is that the same as eating the vegetable itself? That's a question, right? And the answer is yes. So you're getting that benefit of it because it's not cooked, sometimes we lose some nutrients when we cook food. But when you blend in a smoothie, you kind of get a lot of vegetable content that way. The only thing that I caution about smoothies is that we tend to add a lot of sugar and sugary things into smoothies. But as long as you're kind of monitoring that and not getting too much like kind of sugar or bad stuff into it, then it is a really perfect way to get in your vegetables. Because I know it's hard to eat like 4 cups of kale, but when you actually smoothie it, it's like, oh, it's nothing. It's so easy just to drink it down. And I think that because in general in North America we really don't get enough vegetables, that I'm pro smoothie if you can get the vegetables in you, because you still get all those micro and macronutrients. Mhm. Oh, for the stool, yeah. Okay, so the question is, do smoothies help the bowel work as much as just eating the vegetable? And it does. In fact, sometimes smoothies actually work better because you eat a lot more fiber by drinking it that way. And some people actually have had to tell them to slow down on the smoothies because they get diarrhea with it, particularly when they put a lot of things like, or if you add apple juice as your liquid, like that's got, a lot of kind of sorbitol, it makes your bowels go. And then, yeah, and all the fiber and things make your bowel go. So yeah, it definitely is a really good laxative. You're welcome. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question for the people online is that she asked about there was somebody she knew that went to the doctors and got like kind of a baseline memory test, and there wasn't any problems I think at that time, but he was worried because his mother had dementia. And the question is, is that normal? Should we be getting kind of testing on a regular basis? That's a really interesting question, and it's actually been done. So in the UK, they started this kind of initiative where they thought everybody should be screened for dementia, get a baseline test in and make everything, like see what it is going on and pick up this. And what it actually found is that it ended up being kind of a big waste of resources because it didn't help pick up more people with dementia, but it did pick up a lot of people, that didn't have dementia who were just worried. And ended up being kind of like a big failure because as it didn't really help people. And so I definitely don't recommend necessarily that you have baseline screening. Not everybody should have a memory test before you have symptoms. It's really about helping people when you start picking up that there's something not quite right, and then get checked out, do the testing at that point, and then because then you can make a better plan. But they were finding that it wasn't really making a difference or making people healthier to have them checked early. So it's not about kind of checking out right now, it's when there's noticing those signs start popping up. Okay. So the question is your local GP equipped to kind of help you with those things, or do you have to see a geriatrician? So the answer to that is your local GP is equipped to do that. And I think that, doctors will be honest. Like there was a big survey that was sent out maybe 3 or 4 years now to all like the GPs in Alberta asking, do you feel comfortable with diagnosing dementia and helping people through this process? And about like 50% of them said, I'm not sure. And that's an honest answer. And so since then, it actually really, that survey really prompted for people to start doing more education. And, you know, if you can identify that you have a gap in that, that's what you should chase after to fix that. And so I've been involved as well in many educational initiatives, trying to actually spread the word, teach docs how to, you know, do this and how to recognize when signs are there and symptoms are there that you need to do more about. And it's okay to not be sure the first time you see somebody, particularly if it's the first time you're meeting them, because if it really is a problem with the memory, and I say it will come out as time goes on. So it's okay to say you're not sure, but the most important thing is to follow up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in my next presentation about dementia. But it is, and you know, if there's something not quite right, it will always come out. And so even though family doctors may say that maybe they're not 100% equipped, you know, the other half said they're good. They know what they're doing. But I'm hoping that when they repeat that survey in like the next year or a couple of years, that we're going to see a much better confidence level, because it's becoming more and more prevalent, right, as our population ages. We'll see that. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so the question is using dementia and Alzheimer's interchangeably. They are different, right? So this is the thing, is that dementia is an umbrella term. So there's many different kinds of dementia underneath that, and Alzheimer's is just one type of it. I actually usually say that too. Well, I usually mean Alzheimer's when I say it, because the study was in Alzheimer's disease or something like that, but it's also the most common, which is why you'll hear it kind of used interchangeably. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it's wrong, because I think it creates some sort of understanding, but I think the more we talk about it, the better. That, you know, not everything is Alzheimer's, and that there's lots of other things that are dementia. So I don't know if that answers your question. Do we have any questions from the people online? I know we've got 19 participants online, so I think you guys can unmute if you have a question. I'll just give a second. Give them a second. But it's okay. Yeah, if you guys have any other questions. Sure, Jennifer. Oh, no. No. There is a lot of apps. I don't keep track of them. I am really technologically backwards. I I rely heavily on my husband, and I thankfully have a cousin who's in IT, which I call him every time. So you know, I'm not using a lot of apps. I know that there are people who are. I've tried out a few different apps from like the Alzheimer's Society and things like that, and I find that I don't really use them because they're very complex, even like for me. And so, but I know that there are a lot of simple apps that people are using, particularly technology wise. I have, you know, patients tell me the Google Homes are helping them so much, because they can just verbally ask the Google Home to, you know, remind me to do this in 10 minutes, or, you know, set an alarm for this, or, you know, and that smart home thing is amazing. And you can just ask, it's like, you know, you can even ask the questions like, what's my dog's name? And it'll tell you, you know, and I find that technology actually is becoming way more useful to my patients with dementia, is they can just ask the question out loud and Google will tell them the answer, and they kind of love it. There is a question online here and asking, do I do the FAB test on seniors? So the FAB test, FAB, is actually something called the Frontal Assessment Battery. This is a test actually checking for the frontal lobe function in a person, whether or not your frontal lobe is really a lot your personality, it's your impulse control, it's your planning. So it's a test to kind of check those functions. It's a small test. And a lot of it has to do with, can you follow instructions? Like, can you do this sequence of movements over and over again and keep track of it? And I do use it rarely, but I find that with a lot of these memory tests, I actually don't rely a whole lot on memory tests. It's all more about how are people functioning? What's the story? What have people noticed? Because the memory test, it's a number, and it's highly dependent on, is your first language English? How much school did you do? A lot of these pen and paper tests or even task tests are very variable. And I don't put a whole lot of stock in pen and paper tests. I like more, if I'm really wanting to figure out how somebody's doing, is I like more of those tests that make sense. Like, oh, can you make me a cup of tea? And let's see how you go through that process. Or like, I still write checks. It's like, oh, okay, so here's like a fake check and here's your bill. Can you, I like those tests that are practical and it makes sense to somebody, rather than, okay, can you name me, like 11 animals with legs? Yeah, with 4 legs, or even just legs. I find, and not everybody agrees with me in terms of my colleagues. They hang a whole lot on the numbers of the test, but I don't. It's more about the whole picture of the person, and can you see what's kind of going on with them. Yeah, that's a really good question. Mm. Mhm. Mm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is. And we do it whenever somebody kind of comes in and you're like, okay, we're noticing some changes. So where are you now? And it does, in the same person. But when you're kind of like testing them fresh, sometimes it really doesn't like make a difference in the moment. It doesn't help. I always say it doesn't really help me diagnose a dementia because it's more than that. It's more about how are you living your life? Are you managing with what you're doing? Because you can do terrible on these tests and still be perfectly fine and very independent. Yeah, good, perfect, wonderful. Have we run out of time for that segment? Oh yeah. So 3-minute break. All right, everybody take a 3-minute break. Oh, do the windows. Oh, well.
We're going to continue on with our second presentation, and it's dementia diagnosis, treatment, and what else matters.
All right, so the people online, we're about to get started. I do see a couple of empty seats, but that's all right. I'm sure they're coming right back. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about dementia today. I'll try to stay on time, but we can stay online a little bit longer for questions afterwards. Yeah. Okay, perfect. I see Ellen nodding her head, which is great. I love it. Okay, so I wanted to kind of, it's a big topic in terms of dementia, but keep it as simple as possible to tell you kind of the basics and also what I think is really important in terms of this. I will go over kind of in the context of a case, a very typical way that somebody might present to the family doctor with some memory problems, and then how I would work that up and how you might expect somebody to work it up too as your family doctor, just so you know what I'm looking for and what we really generally should be looking for if we're talking about, hey, there's some memory trouble there. And then also kind of the management afterwards. This is the thing that I find falls through the most is that we, as doctors say, okay, you have dementia, good luck with life, and it shouldn't be that way. There really should be follow-up, and it's just like, and I'll say this probably multiple times, is that it's just like any other disease. If I told you had diabetes, would I say, good luck, have a great life? That would be, honestly a crime in my mind. And think about having dementia. It's, a brain disease, just like diabetes is your pancreas disease, right? It's something that you have to follow up with and look after over time. It's not like okay, we figured out what it is and go on your way. So keep that in mind. So hopefully what you're going to get out of this little talk today is how to diagnose dementia. The workup on it. We're talking a little bit about, because people always want to know about the medications associated with dementia. I always try to put in a little bit about that and talk about realistically what they're good for and what problems you might have with them as well. And hopefully I spend the most time on this is the essential components of a dementia management plan, and then answer your questions at the end of the day. So my case here is this lovely gentleman named Mr. Stevens. He's 78 years old, and let's say I've known him for 5 years, so I know him pretty well. And his wife actually ended up booking an appointment for him, and she's there in the office with you, and she tells me that she's really worried about him being forgetful. He's been forgetting to take his medications. He forgot to pay a few bills, and they ended up getting some past due notices. And she said, this is really not like him. He's also losing his keys all the time. And she said, sometimes he used to lose them, but like maybe it was like once a year, but now it's becoming more and more often. And when you're in the office with him, like he's obviously quite angry as his wife is telling you these things. And that's when she says too, and he's not as easygoing as he used to be, so there's been some changes there that she's worried about. So you look back in his file, and Mr. Stevens, he has diabetes. It's actually relatively well controlled from what you remember. He has high blood pressure. He's got an enlarged prostate, which many men as they get older, they do. And he's never been a smoker. He doesn't drink any alcohol. And his medication list is really quite short. He's taking metformin for his diabetes, a little blood pressure pill called Ramipril. Tamsulosin is to help that prostate problem so he can pee a little bit easier, and a little bit of aspirin, just to make sure he doesn't have a stroke or heart attack. So a little bit more about Mr. Stevens. When you look into his history, he was a high school physics teacher. He's been retired now for quite some time. He retired at age 60. He's always been a baker. He likes to make cookies and etc. for his grandchildren. And he's always been, always been a lovely, easygoing guy who's would do anything for his wife, worships the ground that she walks on. Just really nice. But he's always been the guy who manages all the bills at home, and she's never had to do that. So it was disturbing to her that he forgot to pay some bills. You do actually send out his wife and talk with him alone. And when you're asking him, how he thinks about it, he does admit that he's noticed some problems too. Like he said, yeah, I do notice. Maybe I'm more forgetful than I used to be. So he's pretty honest. So throw back to the last little talk I gave about the 10 warning signs, right, of dementia and Alzheimer's. And if you think about this guy and what you've just heard from him, what I heard was that he's having some memory loss that's affecting his day-to-day activities, so the number 1 square. And I also heard that he's had some changes in his personality, number 9, right, where he's really maybe getting a little bit irritable and not as easygoing as he used to be. So those are the big 2 things. I didn't hear anything else, on this spectrum. So there's, kind of 2 things, and that can be worrisome. So we'd look into it. So I'm going to talk about the dementia clinical workup at this point, what I would be looking at for this gentleman. So I always want to check up physically what this person looks like. I'm looking for their blood pressure. Is it well managed? I'm looking at their blood sugars. And sometimes in the office, just that one reading doesn't help. It's not good enough. And I get them to go home and take some readings and write them down for me and bring them back. Or sometimes I'll follow up by phone and get those readings just to see, maybe it's good in the office, but when you get home, it's really high. What I'm listening to when I have to listen to their heart, I'm actually listening for if there's any murmurs, like anything that might be causing the blood flow not to work out very well. Sometimes people have something called atrial fibrillation where it's beating abnormally, and that makes it higher risk that you're having a stroke. So or you've had a stroke or you're going to have a stroke. So I always look at those things. Other things that I find really important is looking at the full nerve exam. So I'm checking to make sure that all those nerves are connected the way they should be. I'm getting people to get up and walk and see, because many dementias, they actually affect how you walk, whether you become slower or you walk in a certain way. There's many kind of changes that I'm not going to describe here, that when you, as soon as you see them walk down the hall, you can see that there's something wrong. And sometimes it's very specific what's wrong. Then I'm looking for signs of stroke. There's many possible signs of stroke or damage kind of to the brain that you can check on a person's physical exam. And I'm looking for it, because if there's any signs that there's been a brain problem or brain damage or a stroke, then it means I'm going to be looking more deeply at what's going on in there. I'm looking for kind of involuntary movements. Sometimes people like have, they have tremors or they have kind of funny muscle movements and they're just doing nothing, that tell you that they're a tell sign that what's going on that's making this happen. And then Parkinsonism. I am sure most people have heard of Parkinson's disease. And sometimes those symptoms come out too. And it also kind of leads you down a different path about what might be causing the memory problems. So I'm looking for all of those things. And, honestly, if you have, if you're bringing somebody in for a memory check or memory problem, you're doing an exam on them, looking for some of these signs, okay? Make sure that there's nothing wrong there, at least the first time. I'll be honest, I don't check it every time after I do the first. I do a thorough first exam, and then afterwards it's only as needed. So screening tests. So we talked about memory testing already. And that I do it. I do it. So honestly, this is the truth. I oftentimes do memory testing so that I can get coverage for medication if I'm looking at a memory medication, because you can't get coverage without that. There are other ways, and sometimes I have to do that way. But memory testing is a good baseline. We talked about this a little bit more about when somebody presents with memory problems, you want to know kind of where they're at right now, because sometimes the things that you do, if you fix a medical problem, they actually get way better. Or maybe over time, you'll notice they continue to get worse. So it's helpful in that way, and it's good to track over time. So that's what it's really quite good for. You want to do, when you're in the office, a medication review, because there are unfortunately many medications that affect your brain functioning. I mentioned some of them already. A lot of them are over-the-counter medications that people don't realize actually cause them problems. And then we can maybe stop some of these or reduce them or make a plan to change. I don't like to change everything at once unless it's really a dire situation, but you can, make a plan to slowly cut some of these out. And many people get better just by cutting out those problematic medications. I always do kind of a depression screen, because it's a great masquerader. When people are depressed, they oftentimes will complain about memory trouble, especially when they're older, right? And I think that it is important to make sure that, okay, well, it's actually, I don't think it's your memory. It's actually, I think you're really depressed or you're really sad, whatever, words that they want to use to describe it. That's good. We'll go with that and we'll fix that. And sometimes I'm not sure which one it is, but there's definitely depression. I'm going to treat the depression first before I say that there's any dementia there. So we want to rule out delirium. So that's like to me, delirium is an emergency in many ways. Something's wrong. Your brain's not functioning. It's a brain emergency. So you got to fix what's going on there. And sometimes it's, oh, okay, well, you obviously, when I examine you, you have symptoms that you have an infection somewhere. So we're going to fix that infection, and then we're going to look at things after we fix that problem. And then something that we always do is figure out, at baseline, what can you do? I know lots of people, including my husband, who cannot cook. So him not cooking is not a big deal. But somebody who, let's say, like my father, who cooks for my mother's hopeless with cooking. And he always cooks everything. And if he starts having problems cooking, I'm going to be worried. Because that's what he's done my entire life, and he still does to this day. He does all the cooking at home. So you want to know what people's functioning was and whether that's changed over time. These are some of the things that I would look at for, blood or urine tests sometimes. It's very standard to get some blood work done, particularly if you haven't had any done in the past year when somebody is having memory trouble. So some of the things I look for is thyroid function. And there are kind of rare case reports that when your thyroid's really out of whack, your memory doesn't work well. But for the most part, even if the thyroid's is abnormal, I find fixing that problem doesn't fix the memory sometimes. So another thing that's very common, unfortunately, that I see is calcium being very high. In many people, your risk of getting cancer as you get older is higher. And sometimes when you have cancer in your body, it processes the calcium poorly and you end up having really high calcium. And that makes people it really affects their brain. And so unfortunately, I see that very often. But then when we fix the calcium, it actually does usually help the brain as well. Okay, so that's something I always check for. Something that I also kind of see quite often is when the salts in your blood are off. So if your salts are low, usually high doesn't actually cause a problem. It's when your salts are low, like your sodium, it can cause you to become absolutely delirious, completely confused. And you don't know until you check it that it's abnormal. There's not really that same sign. You're looking at kidney function because, like I said, sometimes people have, had blood pressure, really high blood pressure that's been damaging their kidney over years and years, and all of a sudden their kidneys go kaput. And that's your system for cleaning out all your blood. And all of a sudden you have all these toxins in your blood. You're going to be pretty confused. And so that's sometimes how people present is that, oh, I think they're getting dementia. They're getting really confused. And oh, no, their kidneys have just given up on them. I look at blood counts too. Like sometimes people are really anemic. Like I've had patients who I'm like, oh my gosh, how are you still standing and talking to me? Your blood is 40, but it happened over a long time. And then when you correct their blood, they actually get a lot sharper. They're surprisingly, because they didn't have enough blood carrying oxygen to their brain. I would always want to look at the sugars, like the A1Cs that measure for your sugar control over 3 months, because I've seen it both ways. When your sugars are really high, you can be confused, or your sugars are really low, you can get very confused. And so those are things definitely that are kind of not easy fixes, but they are if you can identify that. A vitamin B12 level, this is something, that I check because they have, there are case reports of people who have vitamin B12 deficiency. They can present with confusion, or they can present like they've had an outright stroke, like, they can't move half their body or they can't move their legs. So I do check that as kind of on the off chance that it's a rare thing that will be abnormal, that will cause this problem. Sometimes for some people, liver function tests, I don't always order in everybody, but if you have a possible history of hepatitis, it was much more common before, and it's still roaming around. People have sometimes chronic hepatitis and they don't know it, and they have liver failure, and that's how they present. They present confused. Or people who have a history of maybe drinking a lot of alcohol and a lot of kind of insults to the liver, and we want to check that as well because that can make you very confused whenever the liver's not working. And then the last item that I put on there is that I very rarely do this, but every once in a while I check for drug levels of different medications because sometimes, like particularly seizure medications. So somebody, let's say, had seizure 10 years ago, they're still on the same seizure medication, but their body actually processes the drug differently. And turns out like their level of that seizure drug is way too high and it's making them really confused. So sometimes if somebody's on these high risk drugs, I will order for like drug levels. But I bet you when you're thinking about that, I'm like, cocaine or marijuana and all those things. I don't usually order those. I mean, sometimes I will if I'm really suspicious that something's going on, but it's more like actual prescription drug levels. Okay, so this is a question I get asked all the time, and I feel like sometimes people get really angry that they don't get a CAT scan of their head. So I'm going to explain to you kind of why somebody might get a CAT scan and why some people might not. So these are actually the current recommendations for CAT scans in Canada. If you're looking at the States, and I went to a conference last year in the States, and the word in the state is everybody gets a CT scan, a CAT scan of their head, no matter what. And the reason why is because the people have to pay out of pocket for it. I'll tell you that even of the scans that I do, about like 90% of them are normal. More than 90% are normal. But, you know, this is kind of driven, a culture driven thing in the States where, you know, the doctor doesn't have to pay for it. There's no system consequence. They just pay for it. In fact, some of the doctors now down there are saying like, don't get a CT scan. Not everybody needs a CT scan, but you know what they need? They need an MRI because that costs more money. But it doesn't necessarily help with that person in managing the disease or figuring out kind of what's wrong with them. So there are definitely reasons why I would scan somebody's head. And some of those I already talked to you about. If I examine them and I see changes that are suspicious of a tumor, a stroke, any of those things, I definitely need to scan their head and see what's going on in there, especially if it means we're going to be able to do something about it. Maybe we can prevent the next stroke. We can't reverse what happened already, but maybe we can stop the next one from happening. Those are the people. Also, the first one on that list is people who are younger than 60. So people get dementia at all ages, sometimes very young, but mostly it happens when we get older. So when somebody's young, I really want to make sure that I'm not missing something because they might be presenting with memory problems, but oh, actually you have a tumor in your brain or there's something really, you know, not quite right. So we always scan people who are young because it's less likely that it's a normal thing. And people who are, you know, changing very quickly. And what your interpretation of changing quickly and what my interpretation of changing quickly might be very different. So when I say changing quickly, it's like I had this one patient, she was making homemade pizza and, you know, dinner for 20 people. 3 months later, she can't talk, she can't walk, and she's lying in bed all the time. That is extremely concerning to me. Rather than, you know, the usual course of like Alzheimer's disease where, okay, well, you know, 5 years ago, she was making pizza and hosting 20 people, but now things are not looking so good. She has problems with a lot of things. So, you know, these are the things, and there's other ones, I'm not going to go over all of them, but there's just kind of these specific things when you're examining somebody or you're going through the history, like one of them is cancer. If you had, you know, breast cancer treated 10 years ago, sometimes it pops back up again as a brain metastasis, a tumor in your brain. So, you know, I'm being suspicious about those things. And I heard that there's new guidelines for CAT scans for memory trouble coming out maybe this year or next year. So I don't know if I'm going to change my tune, but, you know, I honestly not pro X-raying everybody because it's very low yield if you don't see the signs physically. So other diagnostic tests. This is something probably that most people have not heard of before, called neuropsychological testing. This is actually the gold standard for diagnosing dementia. It involves like sitting with a psychologist for a half day or a full day doing memory tests with them. I'm going to be honest with you, most of my patients can't tolerate that. They're not going to be sitting for a whole half day or a whole day just going through, you know, test after test after test. But I do use this gold standard for my younger patients where it's like really kind of not so, it's unclear. They're early in their changes and you want to be able to kind of maybe figure out a little bit more of which parts of the brain are not functioning well. And that's what neuropsychological testing is helpful for. I'm not sure that they offer it here. I know they have in Edmonton, it's like a 6 to 12 month wait to get neuropsychological testing. So I can only imagine how much of a longer wait it would be if they have it in Red Deer. I don't really know. So barring that, my best diagnostic test is doing my physical exam and taking a really, really good history from the person, but also from the people that know them best. They notice maybe what the changes are. And those things together tell me whether or not there's something wrong that I need to look further into. Okay, so let's get back to Mr. Stevens. And so when I examined him, he has a completely physical exam. I don't see any signs that anything bad is going on, which is actually most of the time the case when I examine somebody with memory trouble. He doesn't have depression. He's not delirious. And I did some of those memory tests, you know, baseline. His mini mental status exam, he's 26 out of 30. It's pretty much normal. That's the easier test. And then we did the Montreal cognitive exam, which is a little bit harder. And he did a little bit worse on that. He got 20 out of 30, which tells you there's usually something not quite right, like in terms of that brain thinking. And then we looked on his medications, and his medications are a very short list. I'm not too concerned about them. The only problem was when I looked at it, I realized he hadn't been filling his prescriptions on time. He was about 2 months behind. He should have, filled it by then. So that means he wasn't taking them properly. So he's pretty independent. He's doing all of his activities of daily living. He's showering himself, dressing himself, doing all the stuff he should be. And then when I ran the blood work, the only thing that was abnormal was that his sugars were high. So this A1C is 9.2. Normal should be 6 or lower. So his diabetes is not well controlled, but also he's not taking his medication. So that could be explained, and maybe that will help. If we can control that. And then based on my assessment of him, I didn't feel like he needed a scan of his head. There was nothing, no red flags there. I didn't feel like it was necessary. So the question, about this is that, does he have dementia, or does he have something called cognitive impairment? So even as doctors, this is very confusing to people. So I'm going to go through kind of what is mild cognitive impairment versus what is dementia. We talked a little bit about it before. But mild cognitive impairment is actually, and these are the new terms I put in there, mild neurocognitive disorder. I actually really dislike it because it's super long. It doesn't mean a whole lot to people. But it just means that your memory or your brain functioning is not as good as I would expect for somebody your age. And that varies based on age. But the important thing is these problems that you're having, they're not actually causing you to lose any independence. You're able to do everything that you need to do, but it might take you more time, or it might take you more organization, like you're making more notes or you're relying more heavily, but you're still doing everything. There's no problem. People ask me, why is it important then if they're not having a specific problem? The important thing is that actually 5 to 15%, so let's say like 10% of people who have this, like this problem with their brain, they move on to have dementia every year. About 10% move on. So it's important actually also to look after these people and make sure they have a checkup at least a year afterwards to see how they're doing. Because the truth is, some of them, so most of them, they either get better, they stay the same, and then a small percentage actually do move on to have dementia. So following that up. So moving on to dementia, and now the new term is major neurocognitive disorder. There's change. There's things that are interfering with their independence. And they're not able to do everything that they need to in the daily life in order to make things happen. So there's a difference there. And I put in the domains, so we always think about memory as dementia, but it's not just about memory. Some people just have problems with their language. They can't get their words out. That's also a type of dementia. Some people, they just can't plan. They remember everything that happened all the time, but their planning is not working. Other people, they kind of see things differently, or they're not able to navigate the world anymore, and that's a different part of the brain. And then the social skills is another part too. So there's all different parts of the brain that function differently, and we always think about memory as being the problem, but sometimes that's not the only problem, or other things are problematic, and they would still have dementia. So the question is, what's going on with Mr. Stevens? I think with the title of the presentation, you figured it out. But I would say that Mr. Stevens has an early stage dementia. So he's in the mild. So he has very few symptoms, but we are seeing that he has a change in terms of his function. He's not paying his bills on time. He's not taking his medication, and it just means that he needs a little bit more help. And making those things happen. So I just want to briefly go over the stages of dementia, because I think that that's one of the things that isn't really talked about a lot. I separated them, and there's kind of some different models, but I separated into mild, moderate, or late stage, or severe dementia. And I like to think about this whole process of dementia is, we think about when we were born into the world, we had to learn everything that we do. We had to learn how to swallow like solid food. We had to learn how to walk. We had to learn all of these things, and in chronological order. And then as kind of I find dementia moves on, I like to think about it as aging backwards. you're losing some of those skills, and the most recent ones that you learned, they go faster than the other ones. Just in general, but it doesn't always work that way. And as we all know, there's kind of good or bad days sometimes for different things. So think about it this way. So when I'm looking at somebody who's in the early or mild stage of dementia, very commonly they'll have some memory loss. And it's more recent things that they're losing. But all those things that happen, you know, I remember my grade school teacher's name and all those things, they're still there. No problem. That's all there. They might have, we talked about misplacing things, have word finding difficulty. One of these things that is most prominent is that it's hard to learn new things for people in the mild stage of dementia, or it might come out as people refusing to do something that's out of their norm, because it takes a lot of, you know, it takes a lot of brain power to accept something new or learn something new. And even I know myself, like when you're telling me to go into an unfamiliar situation, I've never been there before, I don't know who's going to be there, I do get a little bit of anxiety about it. And I think, okay, how am I going to make this better? Okay, I'm going to go to that place ahead of time and check out the situation so I know where things are before it happens. So, you know, if you think about that, it does take a lot of planning. And as early in the disease, that begins to be a problem. And it's harder to actually plan activities even. We mentioned about losing track of days, but usually there's no problem. You know when it's day, you know when it's night, that kind of thing. And then the problems that first come out is actually more higher level things, like paying bills is something we learned to do much later in life than we did to dress ourselves and you know, feed ourselves. Those are activities of daily living. And then we call IADLs is independent activities of daily living. So those higher order functions, like how to cook and how to pay bills and do those, how to drive. So that's the early stages. We talked a lot about it, I think. But in the middle stages, as things go on, we know kind of we're in the middle stages when people start needing help with their activities they're living. Like those basic functions, like I said, getting dressed every day, feeding themselves, like, you know, making sure you get to the bathroom on time, those kinds of things. When they start to get, when they start having problems with that, that's kind of when we know they're in the middle stages of the disease, because those are things that you learned on pretty early on. Oftentimes, people in the middle stages need more reminders to do things, but they're able to do it when they're reminded. Sometimes this is when day-night reversal starts happening. You're not sure if it's night, not sure if it's day, and missing kind of some of those cues. And they might, at this stage is when people tend to put themselves at more risk, like they leave things on the stove and they burn them, they forget about them. And that's can be a safety risk. And it's also in this time, like in the moderate stages, and I always call it the teenager stages of the disease, where sometimes it's really a big change in the personality. People get angry for kind of no reason. Usually there's sometimes some reason, but it's difficulty controlling your emotions. And I think about, you know, if you have teenagers for no reason, they're like, I hate you so much, like, you know, and they just say terrible things sometimes. And this oftentimes happens in the moderate stages. Not everybody, you know, thankfully, not everybody goes through kind of all these symptoms. These are just kind of some signs when you're in a certain stage. And sometimes in the stages, while people are not able to tell you when they're in pain, they're just agitated or they get a little upset and you're like, what's going on, you know, and they can't really tell you, or they can't identify themselves what's going on. And then also in this stage, you'll see there's delusions. I don't know what it is about the human brain, as we kind of tend to have dementia. We get very suspicious of people, and almost always people say, like, if something goes missing, it's stolen, right? And I would love to know why. But our brain kind of defaults to the suspiciousness, and I see it all the time in you know, the early to middle stages of dementia, where there's these beliefs of things that are happening that, you know, certainly they could be happening, but you think that most likely it's not. And sometimes actually I've been proven though that people were telling me these like kind of really funny things, like somebody stealing from them, and it turns out somebody was stealing from them. So, you know, I never disbelieve people, but we want to know kind of what's likely to be true. So then when you get to the late and severe stages of dementia, usually people are very completely dependent for all of their care needs. Like they need, they need to some help with dressing, even sometimes with walking and with their food. But not everybody, even if they have some symptoms of the late stage, they're not necessarily completely dependent. I have many patients in the late stages who could walk like miles and miles and miles, and they keep walking, or they always feed themselves no matter what. Some of those functions are intact. What I always say is that what ends up showing up as a problem early in the disease, so people who have trouble finding their words early, oftentimes by the end they can't speak at all, except they usually can sing because that's a different part of the brain. People who end up in early stage of dementia might have trouble walking, having falls. They'll usually not be able to walk anymore, or not able to walk safely anyway by the end of the disease. So everybody's a little bit different. And so it's very often too at the end of the disease, in the severe stages, people will have difficulty swallowing, because if you remember, as I mentioned, we all had to learn how to swallow solids and do it and not actually shovel everything into our mouth as well, which, I love watching my little nephews, because they just shove and they shove and they shove, and I'm like, it's not a chubby bunny contest, you have to actually swallow that. But that happens, and that causes that risk of choking. And then unfortunately at the end stages of dementia, the thing that kills patients, and people who ask me, I'll tell them honestly, is that what kills people at the end of dementia is not actually dementia itself, it's infection. And a lot of that infection risk is from inhaling food. It can be from bladder infection. It can be from laying for long periods of time and not moving and developing an infection on your skin. Those are the most common things. And it is actually, even if people keep eating lots and lots and they eat well, they tend to lose weight at the end of the disease, and it's part of the disease that they're wasting and losing weight despite that. And one of the things that I always check for when I'm doing the examination as well is something called primitive reflexes. I don't know if you guys have had a baby around recently, but if you put your fingers in their palms, you can lift them up, right? Like, because we're all just little monkeys, really. And when they get that stimulation, they just grab on. And that usually comes back at the very late stage of dementia, because that's a reflex, and it's to keep you safe, right? When you feel danger, you just grasp on and you don't let go. And that oftentimes comes back at the end. And sometimes, unfortunately, people are misunderstood and told that they're being aggressive because they latch on and they can't let go. And what you'll see as well is people tend to get distressed, or they might be agitated or aggressive because they can't necessarily interpret what's going on. If somebody's coming at you, and I'll give this example of when I train a lot of students and residents. One of my residents, he's 5 years into his training, he's finishing next year, and I'm watching him do the physical examination, and we're looking at the thyroid, right? Because thyroid's one of the things that we're concerned about. And he comes at the patient with both hands towards his face, and the patient goes, duh! And I was like, oh, we're gonna step back for a second here. And he's like, what's going on? So you didn't give him any warning, you didn't tell him what you're doing, and all he saw was this. And that's very threatening. So, we have to be more conscientious of what we're presenting, to people who have later stage dementia. What would you see if that's all you saw, right? Exactly. Also, what's your history? So we have to think about those things, right? So that's the later stages. And so I mentioned Mr. Stevens, he most likely has early stage dementia. And this is the perfect stage, to be diagnosed in my mind, because it means that you can do a lot of planning for yourself, and you can make things happen so that your journey is a much easier one, just like diabetes. If people know that you have diabetes, maybe you have a tendency to have low blood sugars. When they see you kind of fading, they're like, oh, okay, let's get you something to eat, right? You got to train your team to help you. So I mentioned the question about memory medications. Everybody wants to know, can I take a pill for this? And I'm going to give you the down and dirty about these medications is that these are the memory pills. There's 4 of them that are on the market right now. 3 of them are basically the same class of medication. They work the same way. The 4th one works a little bit differently. That one's called Memantine or Abixa. And that one's for more late stage and moderate stage of disease. That's what it's approved for. I'll be honest, all of these medications are very modest in terms of what they do for you. And I'll go over more specifically. So, what do these memory pills do? I say modest, and I always try to illustrate for people what that means. It means what the studies have shown, that if somebody takes this medication who has dementia, most of the studies are done in people with Alzheimer's, versus somebody who doesn't take this medication over years. What they see is that the person who takes the medication can do one activity of daily living. So I remember that's getting dressed, going to the bathroom, feeding yourself. They can do one of those things for 6 to 12 months longer than somebody who doesn't take the medication. Yeah, right? So 6 to 12 months longer than somebody who doesn't take the medication. To some people, when I tell them that, they're like, that's great. That means I can, take care of myself for 6 to 12 months longer. For other people, their answer is, that's it. I have to take a pill every day for that. So that's, and that's exactly it. It's about split. Half people think that's a good idea. Half people think that's a bad idea. And the number needed to treat to make that difference is out of 11 people that you treat, 1 person will definitely have that kind of benefit. So you need to treat 11 people. It's not great. It's not terrible either. And what people are most surprised about is that this memory pill does not help your memory whatsoever. There are rare cases, I would say, a handful of my patients that they actually do get better when you start them on the pill, but that's not at all the expectation of this medication. It doesn't make you better. The benefit is that you either don't change or your change is slower. You lose your abilities a little bit slower. So having said that, okay, that's the benefit. And the question about who benefits. So these medications are studied mostly in Alzheimer's patients. So those are the ones that we mostly recommend it to. But I'll tell you that it is quite beneficial for some specific types of dementia as well, something like Lewy body dementia, which is a very specific type where people have hallucinations usually very early and they have motor changes, like movement changes. They do benefit as well from these medications. And sometimes people who have a mixed dementia, they do better maybe on these medications. And you really want to look at it with people who are early in the disease. They have a lot of independence to preserve. You want to keep them as well as possible doing what they want to do. That's what I talk about. And the question about, does it help with people who have behavioral or psychological problems related to their dementia? The jury's out. It's not really like 100% that it's going to work, but sometimes it's worthwhile trying. So, okay, now those are potentially the benefits, very modest. So what are the side effects? What's the problems? So I mentioned to you that 11 people, like you've got to treat 11 people to have 1 person have benefit. So 11 out of about 11 people, 1 person will have completely intolerable side effects to it. So it's about kind of half-half, right? Or if you can tolerate or not. So oftentimes people get nauseated, they lose their appetite. Some of them get very bad vomiting and diarrhea with it. And sometimes if it's mild, it does taper off after the first couple of weeks. And then it gets better from there on. But sometimes for some people, it doesn't go away. Sometimes because of the nature of the medication, it actually causes people to lose kind of control of their bladder. They get urinary incontinence by taking this. And that always has been an absolute no for my patients. They're like, if I get that, I'm off of this medication. I'm like, I understood you 100%. I am not married to this medication and neither should you. Sometimes, rarely, it can slow the heart rate. So if you already have a really slow heart rate, it might not be the good medication for you. People who have severe COPD or asthma, lung disease, this medication can worsen those symptoms and worsen your lung disease. So cautious. And there is a possible increased possibility of having a bleed in your stomach lining, in your esophagus, somewhere along the way, especially if you're taking something like ibuprofen or aspirin, other things that irritate the stomach lining, it increases your chance. I always say to people, if we're going to start this medication, I want you to, call me right away if there's any problems with it, because I'm not married to this drug. We'll stop it if you have any problems with it. But usually I check in with them maybe 2 or 4 weeks after, because that should be enough time to know if you're going to have side effects from it. Side effects don't usually pop up 6 or 8 weeks later. It's always within that first month you'll have some problems, if you're going to have problems. And so the next thing that I put in there is who shouldn't get a memory pill. People who really have maybe no independence to try to preserve anymore, it's really maybe not worth it, because if you can't do anything for yourself at the stage, then you're not preserving anything. You're just taking another pill. And some of these ones that I put in here really are all of those bad side effects. If you have those bad problems already if you have bad lungs and you don't want it to be any worse, then we're not going to use this medication, okay? And very rarely do people have allergies. I've never had anybody who's had an allergy to the medication tried it. And then another thing that I haven't mentioned in the previous slide is that people who have end-stage liver disease, because all drugs are usually processed for the liver. If your liver's not working, maybe we want to minimize drugs in general. So we might not use this medication. So talking about when to stop a memory pill, when you have side effects that are not tolerable, 100% it's gone. For some patients, because there's a memory problem, if they're not able to take the medication regularly, it's not worth taking it. If you're missing it half the time, you might as well not take it. It doesn't make any sense. Patient preference. Sometimes people say, I'm at the point I don't want any medications anymore that I don't absolutely need, and then maybe we'll stop it at that point. Sometimes things change with their health, new health problems pop up, and you want to have to relook at that. And as I mentioned, it is covered by the Alberta government right now, but that could change, or maybe your memory test gets so low that it doesn't cover it anymore. And then you have to think about, okay, do I want to pay the $1 a day to continue taking this medication, or is it time to maybe try to come off of it? So that's always oftentimes what happens. Yeah, go ahead. No, so this was a question about testing. The testing actually, they require it every 2 years. Officially, it's 1 year, but usually they don't catch on until 2 years is over that you haven't redone it. So then they'll ask for a new form 2 years later. Yeah, so they're approving them usually now for 2 years. So it's good. You're not constantly testing somebody for no reason. And then if you do stop the medication, I always tell people to keep an eye out for, people who take a dip, because there are people that you didn't think it was doing anything for them. And then when you stop it, they take a nosedive. And if you're able to restart that medication within 2 weeks, that's what the science says, you might recover from it. But if after 2 weeks, they usually don't recover even if you restart it. So that's why it's important to check in within that 2 weeks of stopping the medication. Okay, so this next one is the most important. I'm finally to management, although I'm running a little bit late, but I'll keep going and hopefully keep you entertained. So this one is probably the most important thing about management. I talked a little bit about this already, but I see this, if you are able to diagnose this early in the disease, it means it's an important opportunity for you to train your support crew. You train your people, to, look, help you when you need to, and so that they know what you want and what you don't want. And it's just like I mentioned the example with diabetes, right? If I have diabetes, I want you to know, and I want you to know that, oh, you're a little bit off. You seem a little bit, oh, well, here, I'm carrying, some of my friends who have diabetes, they have everybody around them trained. They're like, oh, here's a cookie, here's a candy. I keep them in my pocket now. And you want to think about having, if somebody has dementia in the same way, it's like something's going wrong. Okay, let's figure this out and we can manage it. One of the big things that I find a lot of my patients and friends tell me who have memory trouble is that they feel a lot of shame about it. And it's a stigma about dementia, when they kind of in some ways get over it, they tell me that things are so much better for them actually when they get over that feeling, because all of a sudden you're out open telling people know, they try to help you, right? And the people who don't want to be in your life or don't want to help you, they go, and really you didn't need those people, or you don't know, You don't need them anyway. So it's kind of being out there and actually telling people makes things so much better. For yourself and as you move on, I mean, that's very important. And I know, you know, some people have told me that they actually tell everybody in their neighborhood because if you see this lovely, my lovely wife wandering in the neighborhood, know that she lives here. And you know, some have gone as far as giving their card out and saying like, this is my number, if you see something kind of funny going on, please give me a call. And it allows that person to be so independent, right? You increases your safety net. So it is important to think about it that way. This is an opportunity. You know, it's not the end of your life. You still have a ton of life to live, and that's what's important. And that's why I put this picture in there, because you have a lot of mountains to scale. You still have a lot of things to do, and maybe you just need a little extra helping hand to do it. So these are kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the medical management plans pieces of things. But you know, one of the things that I see is that you get the diagnosis, and maybe you get the prognosis, right? Like how long you're going to have this dementia, what's going to happen as it goes on. And for those who are curious, the average time span where somebody has dementia to the kind of end of the stages is about 10 years for Alzheimer's. And that's the one where it's the most predictable. But I have patients, you know, one patient, he's 20 years and he's still in like the early stages moving into the moderate, but he's doing real good and he has super positive attitude about things. So, and he's very active, right? And so it's talking about the reality is that, you know, maybe trying to change your mindset about needing more help over time, because I find the people who are able to accept help, they do the best. And they do everything that they can to, you know, optimize their independence. But hey, everybody needs a little help. I mean, we all do. Even if we don't have any memory problems, need some help sometimes. It is hard to ask though sometimes. You want to take this opportunity, right, to talk about, because talk about the future. And having a diagnosis like dementia makes it much more likely that you might end up in a state at some point where you're not able to make decisions for yourself. So you can choose the people who will help you and have the conversations about, you know, what you really want, what you don't want. And sometimes for that person, it's actually just discussing funeral arrangements because that's all they care about. So I think it gives you that opportunity for dialogue. I oftentimes, if not always, refer somebody to the Alzheimer's Society when I make a diagnosis, or I'll do it in the follow-up because they're not ready in the first visit. Many people have told me that that connection was their lifesaver. Many actually have people told me that's the only thing you've ever done for me. And I'm like, that is fantastic. If I've done that one thing for you, I'm so happy. Connecting you with other people who are going through the same thing, and helping you understand what's going on, right? What's happening. I think that's important. And, you know, it's also an opportunity for me to take a look at everything else that's going on and make sure that your health is as good as it can be, because many things like uncontrolled blood pressure and sugar can make your memory worse over time and make your brain function worse. And then I like to also cut medications at this stage because I'm like, do you really need that? Yeah, I'm very anti-medication. I'm sorry if that comes across very clearly. So it's also an opportunity for you to establish formal but also informal supports, figuring out, you know, who's around you that's gonna be helpful to you, or maybe identifying for some of my seniors that they don't have those supports, and how do we make additional supports? How do we make this work over time? Because I want everybody to be as independent as possible and do what they want to do. You know, I talked about advanced planning, assessing for driving. This is a very touchy subject, but I think usually when I diagnose somebody with dementia, and they're still driving, I always tell them, and I always tell them it's now is a perfect time for you to start thinking about driving retirement. I'm not saying that you need to stop driving now, but it's going to happen at some point. But typically, on average, people who are diagnosed with dementia, they continue to drive for 3 years after they're diagnosed. And, you know, that's fine. Like, but it's knowing that the time for retirement in driving is coming in the future. And then, you know, for some of the management is that if it's an unusual case or things don't fit into, you know, the scenario that I talked to you about, it is important for you to maybe look at getting a more specialized assessment, coming to see somebody like me or seeing, you know, another geriatric specialist. And part of the management is to, I always say that the linchpin of caring for somebody is making sure that their caregiver is taken care of. So if you don't check in with the caregiver, or if you don't know them very well, that's going to be a problem, because all of a sudden, usually a crisis comes up and it feels like it's out of nowhere, but it actually has been brewing for a really long time. So it's really important to have that connection too with all the supports. So I mentioned dementia is a chronic disease that we need to really look at it that way. And it's not like okay, here you go, here's your problem, go forth. I did put in a little reference here to the top guidelines, which is Alberta-based guidelines on diagnosis and management of dementia. I find that they're really good. It's very clear. It's geared towards people in medicine or healthcare, but I think it's actually still very readable for the general public, which I actually like about it. So I'm gonna just stop there for a second, and I'm just gonna take any questions you guys have, and I love any feedback you have as well. If you thought you were gonna get something different today, that would be good to know as well. No problem. Thanks for having me. It's very exciting to be in a room like with real people.
So there's a lot of really amazing material that we went over, and I know Ellen's asking people to type in their questions, but I'll open it up to everyone in the audience.
Oh, people couldn't hear what you just said, Jennifer. Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, but so Jennifer was just talking about all the good work that's happening in the community and building the support team really inside, you know, your community, and it may not just be people who know you. I think that's super important. Yeah, if you guys have any questions online, please feel free to type them in, or I'm going to be listening in on the headset too and see if I can hear anything. But in the meantime, what I might do is just take any questions that you guys might have here while we're waiting for some to come in online. So go ahead. Is it genetic? Yeah, so the question is dementia genetic? There are some known factors, some known genes that we know if you have this, you're going to almost 100% get dementia. And then there was the one I mentioned earlier about the ApoE gene, and that was like, it just increases your risk, but it's not a given. So there are definitely some genes, like for example, like Huntington's disease always results in a dementia. So, you know, if it tends to run through your family, it's, you know, honestly, I don't do a whole lot of genetic testing because more like probably 99% of people who have dementia, there's no family real history of it. And it's very small amounts of people. And those who have those genes, it's like without fail, kind of every member of the family will have dementia. And they end up usually getting some sort of testing for that because it's like, oh, it's really, really prevalent. Or some of the people who have the gene mutations that actually caused dementia, it comes on really early. So it's a very different presentation. good question though. Yeah. Oh, there's just somebody asking about getting the PowerPoint sets, and Ellen already wrote back saying that they can send them out. But yeah. Well. Yeah. For people online, Wendy's just saying like to just ask for resources, and look in places. And Wendy is a wealth of knowledge in the community here, and I know Jennifer is, and Ellen as well too. Like, I mean, I think it's reaching out and asking for resources, even if you think that there is none. Sometimes I'm always surprised about things that pop up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. No, Wendy's just saying that there's more resources, and sometimes the docs are not accessing them. And then, yeah, thank you so much, Adele. Yeah, Adele's just asking about that. For more information, please feel free to contact Healthy Aging Program, Wolf Creek Primary Care Network. Wonderful. That's awesome. So we won't keep you guys. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the beautiful, beautiful day. Oh.
That was awesome,
Yay.
Dr. Kagan?
Dr. Kagan, oh yes, I love Dr. Kagan. He's a good friend.
Thank you all for coming if you are still online, and we hope that we will see you next week for the next edition of our education series. If you want any more information, please feel free to let us know. And we'd be happy, and just so you know, the invitation that you were sent to join us this week is the same for all 4 weeks. So feel free to keep that handy and join us again next Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock. And we will hopefully we'll give you some more education. So please join us again next week as well. Thank you all for coming.